and you have the mother of all disaster risk problems. And we've got a lot of people on this planet in the tech sector, in the science sector, and other places who haven't applied all of their skills and capabilities. They've been too busy, making AI bots that sell shoes or what have you.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delavan. So when the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved their doomsday clock 1 second closer to 89 seconds to midnight, I think maybe they got an advanced copy of what Jim Hansen had to say today.
IPCC defined a scenario, RC 2.6, which gives a 50% chance to keep warming under 2 degrees. But it is an implausible scenario that assumes power plants will burn biofuels, capture the CO2, and bury it. That scenario is now impossible. 2-degree target is dead. The current United Nations policy approach is hopium, hope that actual emissions can be net zero in 25 years. I already showed that that is nonsense. We have retained a policy approach that makes it now impossible unless some miracle occurs that we don't understand.
So, weirdly, after hearing that, I had some trouble sleeping, so I decided to get out this episode with a couple of interviews. You'll have a two-parter here on the topic. Hansen became famous back in 1988 when he testified in the U.S. Senate about the coming impacts of climate change. That testimony helped accelerate international efforts to try and limit global warming. 37 years later, Hansen and a platoon of other researchers now estimate that we are not only, for all intents and purposes, past the 1.5 degrees C warming threshold, but we're on track to hit 2 degrees C by 2045 without solar geoengineering, finding ways to increase the amount of sunlight reflected back into space. Last year, the global temperature averages were more than 1.5 degrees C, higher than pre-industrial levels for a full calendar year. That's the first time that's happened, and much faster than most climate models predicted. Yes, there was an El Nino event, which makes things a bit warmer, but it couldn't account for the acceleration in global heating. So Hansen and co. have been studying what they call aerosol forcing. In simple terms, to combat the air pollution and millions of deaths from respiratory disease linked to it, the global shipping industry agreed to take the sulfur out of their maritime fuels. And in just a couple of years, those pollutants dropped dramatically. Good news. But perversely, that sulfur was up in the air, reflecting sunlight back into space, in part by helping more and brighter clouds. Cleaner air, fewer clouds, darker water. So, of the 0.4 degrees of warming in just the last few years, only half of that could be accounted for by the El Nino event. The other half, according to Hansen's study, was down to taking away those pollutants, which were helping to keep things cool. So what to do about that? Well, we knew this was going to come up in 2025, which is why we recorded a couple of interviews at the end of last year, which we think now is the time we have to put them out. Hence, I'm up late. Because intentionally changing the atmosphere to try to cool things off is something Hansen and some of his fellow authors said should be on the table. Here's Anton Kesekin of Operacio Arctis in Helsinki speaking on the same call.
So together, these factors put us on the track to the future where temperatures will rise, perhaps 2 degrees even in the next 20 years with the current rate of warming that we are now seeing in the climate system. So, and if this kind of 2 degrees warming occurs and persists, eventually it would push some parts of the Earth system beyond a point of no return. So we would see a lot of sea level rise not to mention the other even more immediate climate impacts. Can I have the next slide, please? This is my last one. So in light of all of these points that I've just made, we are now calling for accelerated research on so-called purposeful global cooling through climate interventions, specifically solar radiation modification. And we are fully aware that this is something that, let me put it like this. Let me be clear. We do not recommend implementing any climate interventions, but we do suggest that the younger generation, the young people, are not prohibited from having knowledge of these potential technologies, and of course the potential and also limitations of these technologies in their toolbox. And climate interventions, basically the idea with this SRM intervention would be to reflect a small fraction of sunlight back into space. Basically, we might think about it as just recovering some of the lost albedo that we have just lost in the last few years. Three big ethical questions here. The questions are the likely or unavoidable climate impacts acceptable, especially for the most affected people? So the climate impacts that might already be in the pipeline, are those acceptable or not? That's a big question. The second question, could SRM help reduce some of these impacts? And how does the risks of doing SRM compare to risks of not doing it and just relying on mitigation and carbon removal? And the third one would be how much SRM would distract from greenhouse gas reduction efforts. And this is like the big question for us, and we do take and we must take it very seriously. And the answer is we don't know if it would or how much. But crucially, I think that even though there is the risk of this mitigation deterrence, that risk alone does not constitute a valid reason for rejecting SRM investigations, given the climate situation that we have at the moment.
It's worth saying that not even the people on the call all agreed with that idea. In particular, scientists from the Goddard Institute very much wanted to distance herself from SRM, solar radiation management, being an option, or even doing research on it. So, but given the events we're already seeing unfold in the energy dominance plan in the United States, I think optimism is probably something we're going to have to take a little bit of a backseat on at the moment. Yeah. So we're going to bring you the first part of this two-parter, my interview with Kelly Wanser, the chief executive of the NGO Silver Linings, who joined me from the US. And here's my interview with her. If you're enjoying these conversations, please do, if you can, help support us at wickedproblems.earth by becoming a subscriber. And if you're enjoying these conversations, do leave us a rating and review on the podcast platform of your choice. We get into a lot of the issues around SRM and some of the potential benefits, some of the potential challenges. Not least of which is that, as the host of the call today that Hansen was on, Jeffrey Sachs, put it, this is probably the worst time to be having this conversation, given the political changes in Washington.
Our most fundamental problem is we have a leader in the United States and other countries similarly for whom drill, baby drill is the predominant ethos and policy. That is, by the way, not a leader to whom you want to put SRM or other technologies into their issue. It's not only moral hazard. It's absolutely immoral reality we're facing. We're not facing moral hazard. We're facing an utter political disaster of the whole earth being in the hands of a few greedy interests.
So without further ado, here's my conversation with Kelly Wanser. will be more salient and more prominent in the days and months and weeks and years to come. And I could think of no one better to come on the show than Kelly Wanser, the chief executive of the NGO Silver Linings, who joins us now from the US. Kelly, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for the introduction and context setting for us.
Well, I think it's a very timely conversation, partly for those reasons, and that's why I think it's super interesting to get your perspective. So, and just to be super clear, can you give us an idea in brief about the mission of the organization that you lead, what's related to? Again, I know you're allergic to the term geoengineering, although it's used in a lot of the kind of popular culture parlance. Solar radiation management, I think, is the more preferred term, but you tell me if I'm wrong or right, and you tell me what Silver Linings does and why you guys are involved in this branch of research.
Well, the origin of Silver Lining in our mission today has always been what we call near-term climate risk. And early on in my journey, coming out of the tech sector like you, and asking questions about climate change, I learned about this phenomenon where in every scenario for emissions reductions, every scenario in which we're working as hard as we can to reduce greenhouse gases, the climate system continues to warm for a few decades. It's because the greenhouse gases that are already there stay. There's a lot of latency in the system, and it's really hard to industrially bring them out. So I was very interested in what the risk exposure was of that few decades when, whatever we're seeing now gets worse. And telling us about the risks we've got this uncertain level of increased risk for a few decades. And when I asked questions and when scientists looked at the possibilities for, what could bend the curve within those few decades, that's where we landed at what we call climate interventions, and what the US government and the National Academies in 2015 called climate interventions. One of the reasons is that it's really not so much an engineering problem. It's not building a bridge where, you can parameters and what's going to happen. It's much more like medicine. It's much of, a complex organic system. And you're solving first for the safety. You've got to keep the patient alive. And then you're solving for the efficacy and the minimization of side effects. So climate intervention is a really good term that's reflective of, what we need to do to evaluate whether these things are viable, because we've got to do a lot of science to solve the safety questions. And the engineering is in support of that. But, the space engineering problem, this is a Earth system problem. So the mission of Silver Lining became, what do we need to accelerate, both science and innovation wise? What do we need to move quickly on to have the data, the information that we need to answer questions about, whether we can make interventions and that will help us be safer? And what does that risk profile look like? We have the mother of all disaster risk problems. And we've got a lot of people on this planet in the tech sector, in the science sector, and other places who haven't applied all of their skills and capabilities. They've been too busy, making AI bots that sell shoes or what have you. And, so there are things we can apply to work on this problem. And it's a two-sided problem, which is we've actually got to get a better handle on the projections of what this system is going to do, and how you might intervene in the system and make it safer and more stable. And so our mission, and we're optimists, is like, hey, we've got a lot of people on the planet who know how to do science, innovation, and scale. What are the things we need to scale in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? And most of them aren't engineering, most of them are science. So, but I think that's kind of it. So our mission is not only to advance what we understand about climate interventions, but what we understand about the system that we're intervening in. And because we can't do the problem if we have kind of the level of projection uncertainty that we have now, we're getting very surprised way too often about what's happening.
Right.
And there are
So sorry. I mean, you again. I think again for the listener. We'll try to fix this in post, but essentially there's a bit of a lag. So I hope you can bear with us.
okay.
But essentially, the question I had was in terms of some of these unexpected things that we're seeing. I mean, many people we've heard reported over the last couple of months pointing to extreme weather events like Hurricane Helene or the flooding in the Sahara, which is not something I expected to see in my lifetime, or some of the other extreme events we've seen over the last few years. People talk about it, even if we're seeing effects that we did, some of the models did not predict to be seeing this kind of frequency and greater intensity in extreme weather events as a result of climate change fueled by greater concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which leads to greater warming. So essentially, you got involved in this, a good few years ago now. I mean, like when you were speaking at the TED Talk in Edinburgh in 2019, Silver Linings was fairly new as an organization. But can you? I mean, so you've described climate interventions as being a distinction from other perhaps terms that we could use to describe it. But give us an idea, like, so how do you help? What do you do with Silver Lining? What do you actually do to actually promote some of these things to be able to better understand both the system you're trying to intervene in and what some of the interventions that might be used could do? Because obviously, it's been 5 years since you spoke in Edinburgh. Lots has happened, and not least is because, like, as the Copernicus folks here in Europe said, not 24 hours ago, 2024 will have been the first calendar year on record where we have exceeded 1.5 degrees C for an entire year, which seems to some to be a milestone, not in a good way, where people might be willing to consider interventions that might be more radical than ones they would have been willing to consider before because of the acute nature of the problem that we now face. So tell me what Silver Lining actually does to help.
Great question. Thank you for the question, Richard. So what we did early on, and even before starting Silver Lining, because I've been engaged with the community around these problems for some time before that, but was to say, what are kind of the milestones we need to hit to put society in a safer position within a decade? Yeah. And if we goal is that we had more options in the portfolio to bend the curve, so to speak, if you think about it like a vaccine problem. And you said, well, at the end of the decade, we'd actually like to have some treatments. We'd like to have more in the portfolio to bend the curve and a good set of information about the safety, efficacy, and side of these things that we can make decisions about whether and when to use them. So if our original goal was to try to have us in that position within a decade. So, starting in 2019, here we are, 5 years later, there's some progress that I'll talk about. But the other milestone that we set was then, could we put a first decision milestone set of information in place within 5 years in the model that is often used to support environmental policy decisions, like a scientific assessment? Could you feed a scientific assessment, think of it like an FDA review with better information about observations of the climate system, the model improvements to do the problem better, and information about specific candidate interventions? And could you push research, push R&D along those fronts quickly to populate, a good assessment in 5 years? And that assessment would give you information about, where to focus research next, about where you are with respect to thinking about actual investment and capabilities. Like, do we need to start thinking about having standby on hand kind of measures? And, do we have the information to populate like a real regulatory framework? A real framework of, if we're ever going to use these things, we've got to be able to see what we're doing. We've got to have, the legal triggers in place to keep boundaries on it. Could we start to design that kind of structure to do this safely? And our model in that context was the Montreal Protocol,
Right.
which goes on layer. It's global. Everyone participates. It's legally binding. They use data. And so we worked back from that and we started to define a roadmap of what do you need to basically observe, model, and evaluate interventions along those tracks. And we wrote a report and a paper about this roadmap back in 2022. But we started down the path of working on the roadmap, and we developed the roadmap in conjunction with our engagement with U.S. science agencies, science centers of excellence like NCAR and the UK Met Office, senior scientists. And kind of the locus, the center of that is, well, this problem lives in the atmosphere. A lot of the uncertainty about what's happening in the climate system are things we don't observe very well, and the models don't interpret very well about the atmosphere, especially the effects of particles, aerosols, on clouds and climate.
Mm-hmm.
Particles, aerosols that they want to use to intervene. So the thing we want to use as an intervention is one of the big uncertainties and why our predictions don't work very well. And so this whole problem of can we, instrument the atmosphere, improve the way the models represent these processes in the atmosphere, helps with both sides of the problem. And so a lot of our roadmap is about driving, both public sector, government investments, and, what can philanthropy and the private investment do to accelerate against that problem. And it turns out there are really cool things to do. And when we started, we were agnostic about whether, it's government or philanthropy or what mix. Government's very important, and public sector open science is really important. You're just not going to do things in the physical world at scale that don't run through regulatory systems in countries and at the international level. And those systems have to have their own science basis for what they're looking at. And so for us, it became, how do we start to step things forward, especially in the US government, because the US provides a lot of that type of data to the world and has a lot of the asset base for ocean, atmosphere, stratosphere. And we worked in a bipartisan way on the Hill, starting in 2018, 2019, during the Trump administration, all Republican Congress, to increase U.S. investments on looking at the atmosphere. And so we've had continuing bipartisan support. It's pretty modest. It's nowhere near the scale that's needed. But there are things we can all agree on, and science and innovation and understanding the systems that we're living in turns out to be one of those things.
So I want to come back to that. I mean, again, like the political situation has changed again. But one of the other interesting elements, again, which we can't really avoid talking about, is that, I mean, I was glad you used a framing of talking about like health as being, the intervention, right? And I suppose for many people, there's not many, not necessarily most, but like some people anyway, they hear the idea that like there's a technological intervention that can do something. And again, I think in we'll put a link to the TED Talk that you did in 2019, where you showed a video of, kind of, again, I'm not, you could tell me it's not up to date. That's fine. We could put a caveat, whatever, in the show notes. But, looking at RCP 8.5 with the scenario of like a warming, business as usual, blah, 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 3 degrees plus end of the century, versus, doing kind of stratospheric injection of aerosols of some kind, sulfur dioxide or whatever, and having, this relative effect of keeping the temperature escalation to a certain degree of control, right? But many people and I'm not even sure it's rational. I think it's just basically, for me, the health framing is useful because there are people who distrust vaccines. And
yes.
You mentioned vaccines. And there are people who feel there's a moral objection to something like Ozempic, right? The drug that, kind of is a treatment for diabetes and now has been used for treating obesity, but basically has been popularized as a weight loss, kind of method. for people who have struggled to be able to actually lose excess weight, to really get themselves to a healthy weight. I'm very pro, because I do think that it's like this is a no-brainer. All the the comorbidities that come with obesity, that come with overweight, are so significant and have such huge health consequences and costs, that sure, you need to do all the things, change your lifestyle, exercise, whatever. A little bit of a dog malfunction just here in the background, so forgive us, but thanks, lads. Good job. Okay. But in so far as these are methods of rapidly decreasing suffering and decreasing costs, as we figure out what to do with an individual patient, the patient in this case being the planet or the atmosphere. So for me, I'm kind of pre-sold on the idea that it would be silly not to consider these things, but also sure, in the same way that I would love to see FDA certification, FDA testing, or the kind of equivalent bodies here in Europe. As I guess for me, how do you respond to people for whom there's just an ick factor? It's just it's cheating, like Ozempic. It's or necessary vaccines, which you can have a different conversation about entirely. But for people who think this is a cheat code, which will allow people to continue to indulge in behaviors that are not good, and therefore will give them reason to not change the underlying behaviors that led to the problem. And I think for me, that's where people have an intuitive moral kind of I'm not sure I'm in favor of that. And again, if you forgive me if you might not agree with the analogy to Ozempic, but it does feel like there's some useful territory there of people who just I don't like it because it's getting people off the hook. And there seems to be a moral hazard problem of saying to people yeah, we can avoid the worst effects because it opens the door to people to say, yeah, and therefore I will delay making the changes I know I need to make because you're going to give me an out to avoid some of these terrible, terrible consequences. So what's your reaction when you hear someone say something like that?
It reached the limitation of my medical memory, but so firstly, I'm sympathetic and empathetic to the overall idea, especially for people that have cared about the climate and the environment for a long time, people who've been in the field, who, starting back in the 80s and 90s, when, dialing down greenhouse gas emissions was just a very obvious thing to do. And, really reluctant to research either extreme measures or extreme conditions for climate because it would be so ridiculously stupid to let things get to that point. And, and I and others like me and you are walking it later. And, so whilst and then the notion that you're going to put more crap in the atmosphere on top of what you've already put there does seem counterintuitive. It really does. And so that is where the medicine metaphors come in a bit more effectively. And there are really two pieces to that. One is that we aren't advocating for the use of these interventions. We're advocating for the research. And it's not clear that the research doesn't actually help motivate action on climate. And in other words, the same argument was made about other adaptive measures when, a couple decades ago, people said we need to research adaptation. No, we shouldn't do that because it will, people will lean on that. Had we been doing that, we would have found out just how unadaptable things are. When you start to dig into these climate interventions, you see they have the potential to keep the system stable. You also see they have real limits on their bounds. And they have really uncertain side effects. So like medicine, you wouldn't use them if you had other choices. And the research will draw out, actually, there's probably a very limited scope. So if we keep putting greenhouse gases in, and we let the natural systems emit them, we're not going to be able to do the countermeasures within any kind of a safe band. So I think that, so the sort of answer that we give is really about kind of where we are now and, what we do. This is not in some ways now at the dangerous, perilous place that we are. This isn't counter to the goal of reducing emissions. as the disasters rise, as the heat rises, people are going to use more energy, and it's going to be harder rather than easier to transition away from greenhouse gases. And so there are a lot of good reasons why we want to at least look at it really closely, and a really key factor, really openly. Because the other piece of the equation is, you and I can say, well, we don't think we should use Ozempic. We don't think Medicare, Medicaid should cover it. But some people will use Ozempic, and some drug makers will sell it, regardless of what we say. And so the feature that we think is important is, can we do this in the open? Can we have, governments supporting the research? Can we have international cooperation, open science, open evaluation? And we're all looking at this together. And then if there are disagreements, we can really duke it out. And that at that point, we should really duke it out. But at this point of saying, well, we're afraid of the research, we're afraid of that process, there are a lot of good reasons why it doesn't get you where you want to go.
And you've been super clear in previous conversations that I've had a chance to look at, where there's a right way to go about this research and kind of exploring some of these pathways and potential interventions, and then there's a wrong way. And I think you were particularly outspoken. So there's a chap called Luke Eisman, who runs a thing called Make Sunsets. And I was re-listening to an NPR interview, with him earlier on from, I want to say, maybe last year, might be earlier this year. But anyway, so this guy read Neil Stephenson's novel, Termination Shock. Huge Neil Stephenson fan, big fan of his previous work. And that novel, just to set the scene, is a fictional future world where a Texas billionaire decides off his own bat that he's going to use some sort of super gun to shoot, sulfur into the atmosphere, backed up by planes, backed up by whatever, to be able to inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to mimic the effects of the Mount Pinatubo volcanic eruption, which cooled the planet for a couple of years. And then he decides why are we not doing this? Let's do it now. And does it himself, because the US government at that point in the book is powerless basically to stop him. And so he is able to just do it because he's got the money, he's got the will, he's got the time, blah, blah, blah. So Luke Eisman reads this book, according to his own account, and comes out and decides well, sure, let's do that. And just decides to start filling 6-foot wide balloons when inflated with helium and sulfur dioxide and send to the atmosphere and just see what happens. And has a claim about saying yeah, we can get 175 cars worth of emissions for 1 year out of the atmosphere of each one of these balloons, and he's raising money on the basis of that. And you have been quoted in a couple places, perhaps having a view about whether that's a good idea to keep going, do that right now as we are, as opposed to doing some sort of more responsible way of researching potential effects. Because so first of all, is that correct? Am I correctly characterizing, some comments that you've made in the past or not?
I think the only thing I would say, everything you said is correct, except the word research. Luke Eisman isn't any research.
Oh, no, sorry. What I meant to say, if it wasn't clear, was that you are advocating responsible research. He is saying screw it, let's do it now and just figure out what happens later. So yeah, that's, I think, just to clarify, I was not trying to put any other words in your mouth.
In a crux. And I think that's where it's helpful to people, again, to think about medicine. So Luke Eisman has the same level of qualification for this problem as he would have for a vaccine. And we would not give over, as much airspace or, consideration to someone, if Luke Eisman himself came out and said, I'm going to do vaccines and let's just start doing it, and send me money. People did that, right? And so one of the challenges of this space, and I think perhaps because a little bit of it's sci-fi oranges and the word engineering, is there's a misconception that these radically non-expert people are able to work on the problem successfully. And we keep saying this is an atmospheric science problem, and atmospheric science is hard. It's up there with neurology. And, we need those people to tell us what happens. The atmosphere is quite complicated. The stratosphere is very chemical. And so when you put things in it, it's actually quite difficult to determine what's going to happen. So the idea, again, if you think about vaccines, but the idea of someone buying balloons on Amazon, we know it's easy to stick pollution into the atmosphere. So if you want to fill balloons with pollution, stick them into the atmosphere, not measure what it does, not have any science support, and ask people to send you money, we're saying that's, at this point in time, the idea that you're trying to allocate credits or some kind of monetary value to that isn't supportable. And we've actually, made comments to the FTC of that nature. It'd be the same as selling fake carbon credits, just not supportable by anything. And so we don't want people just randomly polluting into the sky in the hopes that they're somehow knowing what that's going to do. And mostly his balloons probably aren't reaching the stratosphere. And he's just popping little bits of pollution into the sky and charging money. So, our take is that in order for anyone to do like a meaningful scale of these things, which is what would support a business, a financial investment, you've got to have the observations and the science tools to tell you what those things would do, and that would be safe and effective, just like vaccines, where you've got the safety data and you're able to model forward what they do in populations. And so, the funny part of this problem space is just that somehow it slipped through that these people have absolutely no expertise are somehow worth listening to and giving money to. He hasn't raised very much money, so I think serious investors are not serious in that way.
Yeah, last count, I mean, I think it was sub 2 million. So for somebody working on a problem that scale, yeah, it's not a huge amount of money. But again, I think the reason it captures attention, right? The reason it keeps getting headlines, the reason it's like somebody's gone ahead and like broken the taboo, it's like saying, I'm going to do it anyway and just figure out later. Which is very, again, like you've spent time in the Valley. I've spent time with, startups in different parts of the world, including the Valley. But like, there is this, I suppose, horrible thing that appeared on cards in Facebook headquarters of move fast and break things, that's become to symbolize a kind of techno-optimist view about like, we'll figure it out, be fine. Like we can iterate and we can get around all that. But like, what would a responsible path? You've talked a little bit about this, but I wonder if you could expand, Kelly, to talk about like, what would it actually look like? There's been opposition even to do the research, right? I know the Nordics, there was a government-supported plan to be able to do some research and actually do a lot of measurement in the atmosphere, and that was killed at the last minute before the project actually got underway. Again, I'm not going to ask you to talk about the specific context of that particular project because we didn't talk about this in advance. But like, just that happened, right? So like, there are people who were like fundamentally opposed to the research itself. Never mind, right. Like Luke Eisman, crazy, okay, whatever stuff. And you're not saying you're calling him crazy. I'm calling him crazy. His lawyers can call me. But like doing something like that is not the same as doing some kind of vaccine testing double-blind study to be able to say like, okay, what are the effects? How can I control for this? La, la, la. So what would that path look like? And what, if anything, should come out of discussions like, or not limited to, COP next week in Azerbaijan, or next year's COP in Belém in Brazil, where I believe this is going to be a more salient topic. It's not on the agenda necessarily for COP29, but COP30, I believe it is going to be on the agenda more prominently. So like, what does a responsible conversation look like? And what's the evidence base that you would, again, the funding that you provide, different projects, different interventions, the research to be able to actually, help to understand this better? What does that look like as we go forward over the next year, as we can expect to see climate effects get more severe?
So that's a great question. And, I think the difference between, people like Luke Eisman and us is, we don't think the problem is carrying stuff up into the atmosphere. We think there are cool, innovative things to look at that the ways you do that might help you minimize problems. But the real problem is understanding what those substances will do, where you put them, being able to project that well, and being able to optimize that to keep the safest profile. And that's a hard problem. And to your question, and why we don't like the term geoengineering is because it takes you away from that problem space, which is actually our real problem as a society is that we've underinvested in the atmosphere. The global level of investment in the science and observation of the atmosphere has gone down over the past 30 years in real terms. We have observations that are aging out, that were insufficient to begin with. So, the urgency is like, can we instrument the atmosphere? Can we improve projections of what it does if we want to, perturb it, keep ourselves safe? If we want to understand what the limits are of what we're putting in, both greenhouse gases and aerosols. So the conversation that's relatively new at COP about observations of the atmosphere and how do we get them, they were trying to address the climate problem simply by having people commit to stop putting things in. And that's what we've been doing for the past 30 years, is these voluntary commitments to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But we didn't set up monitoring systems to hold people accountable. And we didn't set up monitoring systems to, really have the detail to put in the models to project forward as things got worse. So now the conversation, and we're actually part of a panel with NOAA and with the WMO and with the shipping company Maersk. One of the cool and innovative things that people, with an innovation mindset can do is say, okay, we need to instrument the atmosphere. We need to scale it and do it fast. How can we do it? And one of the ways you could do it is with the cargo ships that travel across the ocean and the airplanes that fly through the sky. Can we develop instrument packages to put on those what scientists call platforms of opportunity and wave out really strong inside the atmosphere measurements that we need to do that first part of the problem? Then we've instrumented the atmosphere. We can baseline models with that. We can use that data to refine the parts of the models that aren't working well enough. And we can do that stuff if we're focused. We could do it in 5 years. And it wouldn't even cost billions of dollars. So that's like, for us, that's a conversation, which is if we can get our arms around the atmosphere, the aerosols and gases in the atmosphere, then we can do us around the climate intervention problem. If we don't do that, then we're in the spray and pray territory of science fiction where we don't know what's going to happen. And these guys can say they're going to put stuff up there, and they can do really simple math based on volcanoes that the scientists know isn't right, and that doesn't tell us anything about the side effects we're really worried about. So that's why we think. So in 2022 we published this high-level roadmap, and in a few weeks, maybe a week or two after this podcast comes out, we're publishing a more detailed digital roadmap. And in the conversations at COP, we really want to focus people on, how do we look at a whole atmosphere approach? Let's all champion getting, real data and understanding of the atmosphere so we can do these problems. We'll do it out in the open. And like I said, then everyone around the world should be able to see and have a say in how that plays out. And if you think about vaccines and the upside versus downside of that, that's the kind. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't equitable, it wasn't perfect, but people could see where we were, and in the situation that we're walking into of such extreme danger, you look at Spain, you look at North Carolina, that's just going to continue, so that people can look at this and say, okay, together we're looking at how this is going to go. We've pushed all the information we can push at it. Let's see when and what makes sense to do.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm very grateful that you were able to spend this time with us. I have a couple more questions if you have time.
Sure.
One was basically on, I suppose, what that kind of, just to drill down one more level on that, right, is basically, what does that wind up meaning for places that, we talked about, North Carolina, we talked about Spain, we talked about some of the places that, again, in the developed world, if you like, it's a problematic term, but fine. But like the people who, there seems to be, if, again, you look at some things that have come out of the UN Environment Program, things that IPCC Chair Jim Ski has said in the last few weeks, where there are people who are very allergic to going near the topic about whether 1.5 degrees C is still achievable in any scenario of emissions reduction or whatever else. The reason that's important being that the reason the small island states in particular, or places like Bangladesh, insisted that the Paris Agreement in 2015 include 1.5 C being an important limit, is because beyond that, certain places on Earth become uninhabitable. Sea level rise is baked in. And so if you're Tuvalu or Kiribati, or indeed, places that are low-lying places in Bangladesh, the idea of signing off on an agreement at Baku or in Belém or anywhere else that says like, yeah, we're fine with that and baking that in because we're totally screwed now, seems insane that anybody would actually agree to that. And so therefore, I'm just wondering from your point of view, and, obviously we'd love it if we reveal any confidences, but, breaking the news here, but essentially like it would seem to me logical that people in those places who are trying to be mindful of possibilities and, kind of interventions they would never have considered 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when they thought like, yeah, we're all being rational and definitely do all the things that will prevent the worst case scenarios from happening. We'll definitely won't exceed 1.5 degrees C. But if the best minds who have been dealing with the climate science for 20 odd years, 30 odd years are saying like, yeah, that's over. If you're in these places, are you now more likely to be supportive of the kind of research that you're trying to pioneer?
I mean, I think people all over the world are a mix of views on this topic, on lots of topics. And, some of them are rightfully and reasonably fearful of the impact of even more technologies that introduce even more influences on the environment. That has not played out well for them. And so there's certainly a piece of this problem that says, these folks in the global north with all of their innovations have made this mess. Now they're going to come in and put more on top of it, and like all the other things, we won't have influence on it. And that's a very, very, I think, valid point of view. And that these things, and you look at somebody like Luke Eisman, these guys are going to spray and pray and say they're going to, really. So that's where, from our point of view, we started out looking at climate risk, and we ended up with programs to try to drive research funding in the global south and in places in other parts of the world, that if you really wanted to have kind of a fair and peaceful way of making decisions about this stuff, you would provide resources for their own experts to evaluate what happens on their own islands, on their own coast, on their own plains, and be able to do those projections and say back to their governments and negotiators and activists and everybody else, here's our best estimates of what this means for us. And so in an ideal world, that's part of what we're pushing on, which is we do science and innovation. A lot of that has to happen in the developed part of the world, but we got to bring people into it so that they can also look at the impacts where they are. And, then we'll continue to get a mix of views, and some will be, heartfelt, philosophically based views, and some of them will be very kitchen table, kitchen sink. Some places are getting too hot to be outside during the day. So it isn't just sea level rise. Like we're involved with a project called Project Heatwave with NYU Medical School, which is, can we project extreme heat? And and some of these science fiction scenarios are looking at responses to mass casualty heat events. So if we can do the projections, if we can get the atmospheric projections all the way through to projections of mortality, then it becomes a pretty straightforward question of, if we're looking at lots of high mortality in the next few decades, how do we bring that down?
Right.
And for us, that's the question we're really aimed at.
So I'm going to ask you a stupidly complicated question before asking you my final question, which is like, so how do you guide a conversation where you are prioritizing kind of like precautionary principle of harm avoidance, where some of these effects, and again, like people could look it up. We'll put some stuff in the show notes, some resources. You've written about this and spoken about this extensively, like some of the risks, right? For the things we don't know, which is why the research is necessary, right? But for places that are less able to cope with potential adverse effects in the global South, whether their voices, their concerns, whether they be kitchen table or be otherwise, be prioritized in some way. And then how do you guard against the research being used by those who simply are vested interests, who have a very large motive profit-wise, to prevent the kind of systemic changes which your site and your previous words have talked about being essential, and this nothing we're talking about here is meant to replace any of that in terms of mitigation, in terms of emissions reduction. I think you've been very clear about that. Everything you've said over the past few years, I'm going to be very clear to our listeners. But how do you guide a process where you've got this kind of Scylla and Charybdis? You've got these two things where basically you've got the people over here who are worried about this, and there's people over here who are like, yeah, but wouldn't it be great if we just get ourselves 10 more years of profits in order to be able to just kind of stretch that out? How do you navigate that to be able to have a rational conversation, that, like, as you say, can build public trust in the outcome of research around this?
Well, and not to be oversimplistic about it, but, based on our experience to date, more information helps both sides of the conversation. And being in a low information context about what these things will do, and even a low information context about what the climate system is going to do and how that plays out in different parts of the world, it isn't helping. So if we're able to push information out and we're able to have that information be in the open, and we're trying to enable that information to go to these more vulnerable places and these less powerful nations, but they have the information, and preferably they're working in a context that gives them some say. That's why we like the Montreal Protocol. It's actually quite a cool, internationally equitable thing.
I should to cut across you. I should have asked you to expand on this earlier. We could put the show notes, but essentially, I know what the Montreal Protocol is. I'm old enough to remember it coming into effect and being negotiated. But could you just very briefly explain what that is?
It's the global treaty that was established to, defend the ozone layer against chemicals, and the ozone layer is really important because the sun has certain damaging rays. And it's the only legally binding treaty that's subscribed to by every country in the world. And it's the most successful environmental agreement in history. So it steered the recovery of the ozone layer, but it also, by kind of its tangential effects, has been the most effective climate treaty in the world, because those ozone depleting substances, some of them are also very high-powered greenhouse gas forcers. And that treaty has since been extended to an amendment that addresses only certain kinds of high greenhouse gas forcing chemicals. So it's still, right now today, much more effective than the Paris Agreement or any other political agreement we've tried to make on climate change. But it's unusual in two respects. It's very science-driven, and its science functions are totally independent of the politics, which is not quite the case for the Paris-type structure. Right. So the science is independent, and the policymakers listen to the scientists. And it has quite an equitable structure in the way its negotiations work. So that makes us optimistic that there are times when we can get together and do these things. And in the United States, the Montreal Protocol is actually something supported by Republicans as well as Democrats. So that's a future too.
And I think that's a good place to come to our final question, because the political situation very, very protein. It's changing. We don't know how things are going to work out, but it does seem to me that, like discussions around climate interventions are going to be different than they might have been depending on if it was a different election outcome. And I'm asking you to be partisan about it or whatever, but just like the reality seems to be like the agenda will have changed as a result. But my final question, because our listeners love to hear from people like you about things that have shaped or reshaped your view, or kind of how you come to this space and stay with this space. We call them catalysts. They can be books, they can be films, they can be mentors, they can be interesting follows on social media, whatever. But are there 3 things that you might want to recommend, or share with the audience that have really helped to, bring you to this space, keep you in this space, and have kind of help mature your views over time?
Well, I'm going to start with one that actually wasn't about this space, but it's kind of a throwback that I thought I'd raise. There's a book called Good to Great. It's a business book. And at that time, it was about the sort of team orientation and humility versus rock star leadership kind of model. This was a reaction to kind of GE at the time and so forth. And so for me personally, that has shaped my view, which is not necessarily the ethos of the sort of modern society. But I think, there's something in approaching problems with humility and with an expansive sort of team view. We're very much a team in Silver Lining, and we actually have a very wide network of collaborators. So I think that's been something that's sort of shaped things. The second is in maybe Mariana Mazzucato's book, which I'm not remembering the name of right now, but it's about the science infrastructure in the United States, and you will find it. But I became involved with the National Academy of Sciences and learned about the history and the real conscious development of the science infrastructure in the United States, all the way, from the rollout of the federal highway system, the national university system, the national labs that we have, all the way through to something like DARPA and preventing strategic surprise. And the shape of that really influences my thinking too, because that's like a really conscious science for the public good that has driven a lot of what we think about in the United States as what makes us successful and valuable to the world. Innovation, open science, free economy, really interesting things. So I recommend that book, and I also recommend looking into and thinking about the history of DARPA in particular. For what we've been able to do, and I didn't talk about too much, but part of Silver Lining, we've been able to accelerate science through innovation and through the application of what people in DARPA learned about how you can bring together smart groups of experts in sort of a mission way to innovate against a hard science problem. And going back to the vaccine example, they did that with mRNA applied to the problem of pandemics. And had they not done that, we wouldn't have been able to develop the vaccines that we did. So that's an inspiring example for us. It inspires the way we work and the way we think about the art of the possible. So that wasn't 3, but that's probably 2. I'll say one other one, which there will be I'm going to get emotional here. There'll be a TED Talk soon. But one of the things that we did, a few years ago, is we started a Global Young Leaders Initiative. And we identified young leaders in the UN system from different parts of the world. And they actually taught us a lot about what we learned about the UN. One of them, Joshua Mponsom, was the UN Youth Envoy. And he recently gave a TED Talk, which we'll share out when we have the link to it. But these, really brilliant young people that are around the world, that are of the age that in Silicon Valley, we fund produce billion-dollar companies, but in the UN system are called youth. They're extremely inspiring, and if we can keep the planet stable enough for them, there's a lot of hope for the future in the next generation of leaders.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. And Kelly Wanser, CEO of Silver Lining, thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you the best of luck in Baku, and I hope you'll come back on the program to tell us how that went and to keep us up to date, because it's such an important conversation, I think, for all of us going forward. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks very much, Richard.
If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.